There's been some discussion recently regarding power. Now, if you've kept up with us on our social media and our training videos, you'll know that we've been talking about power a lot recently. The main reason is because there's a lot of misconceptions around it. I think it can be a confusing topic for a lot of people. I think the reason being is that in the English language in general and also in science, power has a lot of meanings. As far as science is concerned, it has a very simple definition, and that is the amount of energy delivered in a given amount of time, and that's typically going to be measured in joules per second. I figured I'd help break this down with an analogy. So you hear a lot in sports about powerful or a powerful athlete, and there can be some misconceptions there, which I think we can try and help the understanding by going through some examples. So in sports in general, the most powerful athlete is going to be something like a sprinter. Now, what might come to mind is something like a weightlifter that pushes a lot of weight, and that's even called powerlifting. But a sprinter is going to generate a lot more power because in the case of moving mass, moving energy around, power is the amount of weight that is moved per second. So lifting something very heavy slowly is or can be less powerful than moving something like let's say your body very quickly. So Usain Bolt generates an insane amount of power because he's projecting the weight of his body very, very quickly, where someone that can lift 1,000 pounds off the ground is doing that a bit slower, so that the power output is overall lower, even though he's lifting a heavier weight. Now, another example on the far out on the power scale, let's say, would be someone throwing a cricket ball or a baseball. So that's going to be a lightweight, but they're throwing it extremely fast. So the amount of energy that is moving per second is still quite high, even though the weight is low. What it's all coming down to is how quickly you're generating energy. So in the case of an athlete, they're generating energy in the sense of kinetic energy. They're moving something physical, and they can either do that fast or slow. And just to round that off, so lifting something heavy slowly is using the same power as lifting something light very quickly. In the case of lasers, we're still talking about power, but instead of physical mass that's being moved, we're talking about electrical power and the power of the light that is coming out of the machine. When it comes to light, the most straightforward way to think about power, all other things being equal, is essentially just how bright the light is. So you can imagine a brighter laser is going to be more powerful, and I think that's fairly intuitive. That a brighter light is using more energy, and when we talk about electrical energy, when you get your energy bill, you're going to be having kilowatt hours. But that's not what we're talking about. Watts there is the power, and per hour means how much power you've used over time, and that's not what we're talking about. And I've realized that there's so many terms that get thrown at you, and it can get a bit confusing. But the wattage itself is the amount of power that you're using in any given instant. So if you were to, take a snapshot at any given moment, let's say in your house when you have different things, different electrical appliances running, how much power is being used exactly in that instant. Now, lasers come in lots of different varieties, and one of the most fundamental ways to categorize them is how long they're on for. So you have pulse lasers, or you have continuous lasers, and you have lasers that pulse for a very short amount of time, some an extremely short amount of time, and others for a medium amount of time, and then continuous, which means they stay on. Now, in the case of a diode laser hair removal, it will be in that medium category, where we're talking about milliseconds to, up to like half a second. It can get very short. So in the case of Nd:YAG systems, Q-switched Nd:YAG, we're talking about just fractions of a fraction of a second, really, really fast time frame. And so going back to our analogy, you can think of that Q-switch laser with a really fast snap. It's kind of like the baseball player or the javelin thrower. They release an immense amount of energy for a split second, and they release the ball, and they generate an immense amount of power. In the case of let's say that medium range diode laser, you can think of that it's like a sprinter or like a 40-minute dash. I guess it would be shorter. But they're also generating a lot of power, but it's over a bit more sustained time. And then for the continuous laser, you might think of a cyclist, who's sustaining a certain power. And cyclists, measure their output in wattage, and they're sustaining over a long period of time. It's staying on. So this brings us into the concept of peak power and average power. If let's say someone is a weightlifter and they pick up the weight 5 times in a minute, they're doing short intervals, bursts of power, but if you average that over the minute, they're taking rests, so the average power that they're exerting over that minute is lower than the peak power when they're literally lifting the weight off the ground. And we can contrast that with something like a cyclist who is sustaining would be a lower peak power, but since they're sustaining that, the average power is basically the same as the peak because they are consistently outputting the same power. Now, getting back to lasers, what does that mean? Well, you can advertise power, and you might not specify peak power or average power. So a laser with a very short pulse might have an insanely high peak power of tens of thousands of watts, but the power averaged over a second might be really quite low. Now, that was all just kind of an introduction into getting you familiar with these terms that were used. Of course, what really matters is the results that you achieve. And of course, in the case of hair removal, what you're looking to do is destroy the hair follicle. So the question is, how does power relate to destroying that hair follicle? Well, unfortunately, it's not particularly straightforward, because when it comes to destroying a hair follicle, what we're really thinking about is raising the temperature of that hair follicle. And so that raises the question of what is the relationship between power and temperature. Now, that's complicated because we have to run a fine balance. There's a sure way to heat up hair follicles, but that might include burning the skin, for example. So we have to run a very fine balance of the power of the machine, which will really determine the rate that the temperature increases, but that needs to be fine-tuned so that we heat the follicle without burning the skin. You also keeping in mind there that the laser obviously hits the skin, it does penetrate, but a bulk of that heat has to conduct through the skin, and that conduction is not instant. Now, it will take a certain minimum required amount of energy or fluence, and fluence is just energy per unit area, which we won't get into, but they are effectively equivalent for our discussion. But the rate at which we deliver that energy or fluence, which is power, will determine whether we get the result that we're looking for, which is, again, destroying that hair follicle. So let me just illustrate this balance a little bit. Let's say we're going to deliver 100 joules of energy. If we were to deliver that energy in a split second, that would be extremely powerful. And in the case of laser hair removal, that would likely burn everything in its path. The hair follicle will definitely be destroyed, but so will everything else. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, if we were to deliver 100 joules of energy over 10 seconds, then the skin won't even heat up, nothing will heat up, because the energy is being delivered too slowly. The power is too low. So there's a sweet balance in between those two extremes. Now, what that makes obvious is that more power is not always better. You need the laser to have enough power, but if you have too much power, then that is not going to get you the results you want either. So I hope that shines some light on why more power is not always better. And in fact, sometimes less power is better, which is to say sometimes it's better to deliver the same amount of energy over a longer period of time, which is less powerful. And that is perhaps because the hair is thicker, or you're treating a darker skin type. This can allow a longer time for the conduction of heat while not overheating the skin at the surface.